Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. But before we start, I would like to say that I believe that within the next few days, the town by the name of Bakhmut will be renamed, and this town will be returned this original title, and this town is going to be called like Artyomovsk. But let's start from the beginning. And first let's talk about the Kupyansk frontline. The Russians Ministry of Defense reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles including 1 tank and 2 artillery systems, a Katse and 1 Grad. As you can see, the losses for this frontline is untypical. Let's say when talking about yesterday, the Ukrainians lost just 50 soldiers. The day before yesterday, 90 soldiers. And so as you can see, the Russians have activated on this front line. As we discussed, as a result of clashes during the previous week, the Russians managed to pass Lyman I and they entered the south outskirts of this forest, and we can say that they're in the vicinity of Kupyansk. So the Russians already prepared for another offensive operation in direction of Kupyansk on the Kupyansk front line. Now let's move to the south to Lyman front line. The Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, as the result of heavy clashes on this front line, the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, 13 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system D-20. As you can see, the Russians continued their offensive operation. The previous days, I told you that the Russians were doing some kind of support offensive operation of Bakhmut frontline. They were doing everything they need just to pin down, to freeze, to slow down the Ukrainians that located in this area and not to allow the Ukrainians to use their reserves in this front line on Bakhmut front line. But something tells me that this support offensive operation turned into the 100% offensive operation on Lyman front line. The losses are very high, and something tells me that at some point of special operation, we're going to see the losses of Ukrainians on Lyman front line higher than on Bakhmut front line or any other front line. Because from now on, Lyman and Kupyansk is the most important parts of Ukrainian territory and this special military operation. The thing is that, as I told you at the beginning of this video, within the next few days, Bakhmut will be renamed and it will be called like Artyomovsk, according to the Russian title of this town, according to the name of this town before the 2014s and so on. And as soon as the Russians establish control over this area, the next Seversk is the next. And to take Seversk, the Russians need to take control over Tarskoye, Lyman, and so on. But let's discuss this step by step. So we discussed that according to the information we have, the Ukrainians lost around 200 soldiers in the vicinity of Lyman. But as you can see, there are no changes on the ground. That means that Ukrainians managed to move a lot of reserves, a lot of manpower to this front line. Let's take a look at deployment map, and you're going to see that, yes, there are a lot of forces, a lot of Ukrainian forces in this area. There are many forces. There are 25th Airborne Brigade, there is a 95th Air Assault Brigade, there is Jaeger 71st Jaeger Brigade, there is 80th Air Assault Brigade. Their main position is in the forest that located on the west-south of Kremenaya. When talking about the fields in the north part, there is 66th Mechanized Brigade, there is this 92nd Mechanized Brigade. Very interesting updates are coming by the way, from Kupyansk. If you take a look at this map, you're going to see that Ukrainians moved another rocket artillery brigade in the vicinity of Kupyansk. I don't know the reason why the Ukrainians did that. Everything tells me that soon the Russians are going to activate this in this area, and they will start pushing Ukrainians from this front line on the let's say west bank of Oskol River. But from the other side, we see the Ukrainians deploy their rocket forces. Maybe they want to support the Ukrainians mechanized brigade that located in front of Novosilovska, and to allow them to step back safely. I don't know. We'll see what is going to be next on this front line. Now let's talk about one of the most important and interesting front line these days, and I'm going to talk about Bakhmut. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of clashes in the vicinity of Bakhmut, in the vicinity of this town, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles, and 7 artillery systems. As you can see, and we discussed during the previous days about the losses among the armored vehicles, today we see that the level of the losses have been decreased, and the thing is that if you remember, at the beginning, to be more precise, at the end of Solidar storm, we were talking about the salt railroad station Sol, and there were lots of discussions about whether Solidar fell or not. And some sources were saying that Solidar fell, another source were saying that Solidar hasn't didn't fall because of this small block railroad station Sol. It's like a part, just talks and discussions, and that didn't change the real picture. And those days I told you about one person. His name is Madyar. He's the representative of Ukrainian forces on the ground, and we can say that these days he was some kind of voice of Bakhmut from the Ukrainian side, and he was the last voice of Solidar. He was the only one from Ukrainian side when everybody were saying that Solidar fell. He was the only one officer on the ground who was continuing saying that Solidar still under Ukrainian control, and that mainly because of that railroad station Sol. And these days, one more time, he was the voice of Bakhmut, and he was talking about the situation in Bakhmut, that Ukrainians are still there, they're still keeping this town and holding this town. So he was some kind of a flag, or he was some kind of idea for the Ukrainians to defend this town. I don't know how to call him, but anyway, this morning he published a video that he received in order to step back from Bakhmut. And he's a media person. He's a very famous officer on the ground, and many soldiers, many Ukrainians, many soldiers inside of Bakhmut, when they were trying to make some decision, when they were trying to understand the real situation on the ground, they were listening to this person. And imagine yourself, the soldiers who were deployed on the eastern part of Bakhmut this morning, they saw the video that this officer, this Madyar, took a decision, he received an order to step back from Bakhmut. Imagine yourself their ideas, and of course they understand that the defense operation of Bakhmut has ended. And now another operation has started by the name of evacuation, rotation, stepping back operation of Bakhmut has started. But the thing is that there are a lot of problems with this operation. As I told you yesterday, Bakhmut has been encircled. It was encircled, and there are not many ways that Ukrainians are able to use to evacuate from this town. And this morning, these ways were reduced because first, somewhere before noon time, we received first piece of news that Ukrainians destroyed the bridge in Khromovo. So let's take a look at the Western sources map, and this morning there is an icon in this area. We received the piece update that Ukrainians destroyed this bridge. So from now on, there are no way to support Bakhmut using this road. Furthermore, as you can see, the Western source map has been updated. According to this map, the Russians are already in the vicinity or in the outskirts of Bogdanovka, and they're in the outskirts of Khromovo. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians took a decision to destroy this bridge, for one purpose, not to allow the Russians to attack the Ukrainians in their flank from Khromovo while they're doing evacuation and retreat process from this town. Furthermore, the Ukrainians destroyed another railroad bridge, this one, and they cut the eastern part of Bakhmut with the central and the western part of Bakhmut. So the Ukrainians are stepping back, and the question is whether the Russians are able to block this retreat process or to reduce the Ukrainian army as much as possible. I'm not sure that the Russians are able to block completely, but I'm sure that they are able to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible. Furthermore, I believe that the Russians are able to encircle at least 1,000 or 1,500 of Ukrainians in this town, because they're pushing and more territories becomes under Russian control. If you take a look at the Russian sources map, you're going to see that the Russians had some progress in the southeast or southwest of Bakhmut. They control these garages in this area, and they have almost cut the supply, the road that connects the south west part of Bakhmut with Ivanovska. And as we discussed, now there is just one way how the Ukrainians can evacuate from Bakhmut, using these local roads. And as we discussed in the previous videos, now this area I'm talking about, this cloud, is the most important part of this bridgehead, because this is the only, this area is not safe. I believe that Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians at one time during 1 hour take a decision, let's say, to use this road for evacuation, and if they take a decision to evacuate 3,000 soldiers that currently located in Bakhmut at one time, at the same time, using this road, of course it's like it's a very tasty piece of cake for the Russians. So this is the only possible solution, and as we discussed, the Russians have progress in the south, and I believe that highly unlikely the Ukrainians are using the south way to evacuate in direction of Ivanovska. So this road, and maybe possibly this just few kilometers, so the distance, the just 1 kilometer tunnel, just kilometer channel that Ukrainians have for evacuation, and this channel is under fire control. And at the very moment when the Russians entered Khromovo and established control over Khromovo, they will get as close as possible to this area, and they will be able, even snipers will be able to destroy and kill the Ukrainians who take a decision to evacuate. So I don't think that Ukrainians are able to evacuate. The only possible solution for the Ukrainians is to evacuate. Well, let's say there is a like barriers from the Russians, and at some certain point of time these barriers is out of ammo and they need to reload, and this is the best time for evacuation while reloading. So the decision is so critical in Bakhmut. Some sources are saying that there are around 2,500 soldiers. Some sources are saying that there are around 3,000 soldiers and more. I can't tell you for sure, but I know for sure that within the next few days the Bakhmut is going to fall. And that means that the situation in Pridnestrovia is up to begin, and many others operation is up to begin. For now, the Ukrainians are trying to prepare another defense line that goes along Bandarne, Privolye, Minkovka, Grigorievka, Kalinovka, Channel, Ivanovska, and Chasov Yar. So, but this is not a real defense line. I believe that the Russians need just a few, maybe weeks before they're able to penetrate this area and to continue their offensive operation. But I don't think that within March we're going to see Wagner storming Kramatorsk and Slaviansk. As I told you, the next thing the Russians will try to solve is to develop the bridgehead around Bakhmut, and furthermore they need to reach the channel, and they need to build the defense line along the channel that will allow them to short the front line, and that they will allow them to reduce the number of forces per 1 kilometer. So I believe that by the end of March or somewhere in the April, the Russians will try to establish this bridgehead around Bakhmut along the channel, and as soon as they do this, then they will turn their focus to the north, and they will start offensive operation or encirclement operation of Seversk. But I think that if the Russians are able to establish control of this bridgehead, the Ukrainians in Seversk are not going to wait this, they will step back earlier. So, and then the Russians will start movement to the north, trying to encircle if there are anything to encircle. And of course, as we discussed at the beginning of this video, the support offensive operation on Lyman turned into a real 100% offensive operation, and now the Russians, we can say that this is the first day of let's say Lyman returning operation. The main thing that the Russians will try to achieve during the next weeks, it's the Russian army, not Wagner's. They will try to return back Lyman to encircle Seversk, and then they will start clashes for Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. One more time, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers. If we take a look at deployment map, there are also some changes on the ground according to this map, and as you can see, according to this map, there are still a lot of forces inside of Bakhmut. I believe that they're doing some kind of evacuation process. For example, the Ukrainians deployed 67th mechanized brigade in the vicinity of Dubovo-Vasilievka with one purpose: to slow down and stop the Russians, not to allow them to develop their offensive operation and to develop their salient in direction of Grigorievka, Bogdanovka, and so on, and to stop them, to win some time before the Ukrainians complete their evacuation process. Furthermore, the Ukrainians deployed some kind of Spartan battalion or something like this one, somewhere on the west southeast of Bakhmut. I'm not sure the real reason why they do this, because now they need to step back. So I believe that a very big strategy and very big terrible things we're going to see with the stepping back of Bakhmut from Bakhmut. Furthermore, if we're talking about the Bakhmut defense operation, Bakhmut is a very nice town to defend, and the Ukrainians were able to do this for a very long time, but they made a few mistakes. And the first mistake, I believe you are able to find more, but today, for me, I try to analyze, try to understand what did happen wrong, what did they do wrong, and the thing is that the entire defense line of Seversk and Bakhmut was ruined at the same time when the Russians were able to take Solidar. And the Ukrainians during the previous year haven't prepared, and maybe they didn't know where, but they haven't prepared the second and the third defense line that located on the west from the road that connects Seversk and Bakhmut along this road. So there were no defense line on the west from Solidar. No, there were no prepared positions. And as soon as this town was taken, the Russians during the months the Russians established operational encirclement of Bakhmut, and within 2 months the Russians, let's say, got control over entire Bakhmut. If you remember, the Russians started the storm operation of Solidar during the Orthodox Christmas in January. It's like on the 7th of January, so 2 months after, as you can see, the Russians established control over Bakhmut. It's like 3rd of March, but I believe that maybe by the 8th or 10th of March, this town is going to be taken or completely encircled, and there are going to be some places with the resistance of the Ukrainians who couldn't evacuate during these days or something like this. That was the first mistake, that Ukrainians haven't prepared the second, the third defense line that located on the west side from Bakhmut to Seversk. This is the first thing. Another thing is that when talking about Bakhmut itself, as we saw during these previous months, there were heavy clashes in the eastern part of Bakhmut. There were heavy clashes on Solidar and Paraskovivka, Krasnaya Gora, Podgorodny, and this area, mainly in Paraskovivka, Krasnaya Gora, and Solidar, and the eastern part of Bakhmut. And these parts of Bakhmut and Bakhmut agglomeration were reduced to ruins. So the eastern part of Bakhmut, Solidar, Paraskovivka, Krasnaya Gora, Podgorodny, these parts are reduced to ruins. But when talking about other parts of Bakhmut, let's say the industrial zone in the north, the western residential area, the central Bakhmut, these areas haven't been damaged by the Russians. They haven't been damaged by the Russians, and now the Ukrainians need to step back from completely 100% normal fortifications in direction of Chasov Yar. And of course, the Russians are going to use the western, central, north part, south part of Bakhmut as their own position, where they will redeploy their forces, where they will use to deploy forces, to hide armored vehicles, to have places where the Russians can take a rest, to relax, and so on. And this is a very big mistake. During these months, at the moment when the Ukrainians understood that they are going to leave and Bakhmut, they needed to step back slowly from block to block with one purpose: to allow the Russians to reduce the entire Bakhmut to ruins. And from this perspective, the Ukrainians would leave Bakhmut, but from the other side, the Russians would take just the ruins, and of course it will reduce their possibilities, their flexibility and mobiles during the upcoming greatest offensive operation in direction of Kramatorsk. And now we can say that just 30% of Bakhmut was destroyed, and the 70% still normal town, still normal place with the Ukrainian fortifications, with the Ukrainian ammo depots and so on, that now is completely belong to the Russians, or will belong. I don't think that Ukrainians have enough explosions to destroy everything. The only they had is just to destroy the bridges that will be restored immediately, or within the next months, or within the summer period, and the Russians will restore them. Furthermore, Bakhmut is very important from logistic perspective, because as you can see, as soon as by taking Bakhmut, the Russians have a strict railroad connection with Donetsk, Gorlovka, Bakhmut, Krasnaya Gora, Solidar, then Seversk, then Lyman. from Lyman we are going to Kupyansk, and then we're going, let's say, to Moscow. So by taking Bakhmut and by taking this bridgehead till Oskol River, the Russians will be able to establish a strict connection between Moscow and Donetsk. And this, of course, this is very important. They will solve a lot of logistic issues and so on. Another thing about Bakhmut, that the question is how long the Ukrainians are able to hold Chasov Yar, because I don't think that the Russians will start immediately after Bakhmut to storm Chasov Yar. I believe, as one more time, they will try to develop bridgehead along the channel. Then they will try to solve the issue with Siversk and Lyman and the Oskol, let's say Oskol front line, something like this. Because I discussed Kupyansk front line, 100 losses among Ukrainians, and Lyman 200. So as you can see, this area is very active, and the Russians are pushing in this area. Now let's move to the south, to Donetsk front line. There are no changes, just artillery duels. The Russians continue attacking Avdiivka with airplanes, with artilleries. The Ukrainians attack Donetsk from artillery as well. There are a lot of updates about casualties among civilians, but no changes on the ground. The same situation in Ugledar, just artillery duels, heavy clashes. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of clashes on South Donetsk and Zaporozhye front lines, the Ukrainians lost 70 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 2 tanks. Another 2 tanks on the South Donetsk front line, and 2 artillery systems, Gvazdyka and D-20. If you take a look at deployment map, there are also a lot of updates. The Ukrainians took a decision to reinforce this area. They deployed their 15th Artillery Recon Brigade. This is pretty my bad. The Ukrainians deployed 56th Motorized Brigade to reinforce forces in Ugledar. And that's it. And furthermore, the Ukrainians redeployed their tanks brigade. This one, a tank brigade. There used to be tank brigade here, but then the Ukrainians redeployed this brigade in direction of Bakhmut, as I remember, and they left just 1 battalion. And these days they returned the entire brigade, or the bigger part of that brigade, back to South Donetsk, because I believe, or they expect another Russian offensive operation, or maybe the Ukrainians are planning to start their own. And as you can see, today the Ukrainians lost 2 tanks here. Yesterday lost another tank. The day before yesterday lost another tank in this area. So as soon as the Ukrainians move their tanks to the combat line, they start losing them. And we know that they still haven't received the Western. There was just, I believe, some kind of speculation on the Bakhmut front line that about the Leopard. I don't think that there are Leopards on the front line. But when talking about the Ukrainians, all the Soviet tanks, they're on the combat lines. There are a lot of tanks on the south, and we see that Ukrainians are losing them every single day. And the Russians started some kind of, and this is very important number, because if we are talking about, let's say, when we're talking about Kupyansk front line, the most important was just the number, and we were trying to analyze the decrease or increase of number of losses among the Ukrainians. When talking about Lyman, we were trying to analyze the numbers in comparison with Bakhmut. We see that the Bakhmut is about to end the operation, and we see that the level of losses on Lyman haven't been reduced. That means that this support offensive operation turned into the real offensive operation. When talking about Bakhmut, we were trying to analyze the losses among vehicles, because by that flag we were trying to understand the progress of encirclement of the town and the losses of fast vehicles that were moving and heading from the mainland in direction of Bakhmut. But when talking about the south of Ukraine, the most important number is tanks. It's tanks because there are a lot of fields, and there is a possibility to use broad frontline attacks. The fields, by the way, are mines, so the most important numbers on this front line is the losses among artillery and among tanks and armored vehicles. And the higher losses we can find here, the better situation the Russians managed to achieve. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are losing tanks, so that means that there is a small step by step, but a small progress of the Russians. Of course, we're not saying about the situation when the Russians were defeated during the previous storm of Ugledar, and some Western sources are saying about the losses, that the losses during the few weeks of storm was up to 130 armored vehicles from the Russian side. I don't believe these numbers, but anyway, I believe that some equipment were dropped by the Russians, and maybe later they managed to evacuate and they are able now to restore. I don't know, but anyway, we know that there were some kind of that battle was that the Russian lost that battle, and now we see that they're starting from the very beginning, very slowly, step by step, and the first thing they're trying to do is to reduce the Ukrainian tanks and heavy armored vehicles on this front line. Now let's talk about Kherson, and as you know, as you can see, the Russians continue surprising us. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, and 6 artillery systems. 6, right? 66 and 6. And when talking about the artillery, they lost Gvazdika, Getsin Beam, Stabi howitzers, 3 D30 howitzers. A lot of artillery systems the Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours. The same situation on Donetsk. I didn't mention that number, that Ukraine lost 7 artillery systems, 1 Polish Krab, another Gvazdika, 2 Grad, 2 D30, 1 D20 howitzer as well. So the Russians continue attacking and the Ukrainians continue losing their soldiers on Kherson front line without even a combat on the ground, without any battles on the ground. This is a very difficult situation, and I believe that, I'll repeat one more time, the Russians are planning to do something in Kherson, and maybe if the Ukrainians take a decision with Moldovan to start something in Pridnestrovia, I believe that maybe the Russians will try to cross Dnipro and to return control back over Kherson and maybe even over Nikolaev, while the main forces are located somewhere else. And if we take a look at deployment map, we're going to see that there are a lot of territory defense forces. There are like 121st Defense, 29th Defense, 26th Defense, just regular artillery support and so on. There are no mechanized brigade in this area at all, just a few maybe battalions or maybe even campaigns or something like this. So it's not a very big deal to take control over this territory. The only problem is how to redeploy forces from this bank to that bank very fast, and how to let's say cross the fields and to get the outskirts of Nikolaev. And maybe the Russians, maybe this is the part of Russian plan, who knows. Anyway, I believe that this March we're going to see, because one more time, as soon as the Ukrainians loses Bakhmut, they need to cover this, they need to turn or to reduce these negative consequences in society from losing Bakhmut by some victory. And the only possible victory, the easy victory that Ukrainians can provide to society, is this fast victory on the territory of Pridnestrovia. And but this is going to be a red line for the Russians. It's going to be a red line, and can be a very difficult and tough consequences for the Ukrainians if they do this. But they are ready for everything. They need more weapon, and they are ready for everything. And furthermore, I think that Ukrainians are no longer afraid of anything. They understand that this existential war for them, at least not for the Ukrainians, but I'm talking about the top of Ukrainian society, of very rich people, it's like existential war for them. If Russian comes, they will lose everything. So that's why they're fighting, and they know what they're fighting for. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.